Have you ever known someone who, after a great loss, seemed to close themselves off from the world? Or maybe you've been that person, building a fortress of solitude to protect a wounded heart. Hello, I'm John from Texas, United States, your friend and narrator of real stories. Stay with me until the end of this incredible story. Want to see your story told here? Then get in touch with us. This is a story about how a single act of kindness can begin to thaw a frozen heart. Samuel believed the world had lost its flavor. At 75, life had been bleached of its color, leaving only shades of gray. His wife, Eleanor, had been the vibrant color in his life, and since she had passed 3 years ago, he had retreated into a fortress of cynical solitude. His days were a testament to routine, each one a carbon copy of the last. He would wake, drink bitter black coffee, read the obituaries in the local paper, a morbid form of checking in on his peers, and then, out of sheer necessity, he would make the short, begrudging walk to the local senior center. He didn't go for the company, God forbid. He went for the lunch. It was free, and it saved him the trouble of cooking, a chore that had become meaningless without Eleanor to share it with. The senior center was a place he endured, not enjoyed. He saw it as a waiting room for the inevitable, a collection of people pretending to be cheerful while their bodies and minds quietly betrayed them. It's a sad reality that many people feel this way about senior centers or retirement communities. What do you think is the key to creating a real, vibrant community for older people, instead of just a waiting room? Share your ideas in the comments. He would sit at the same table in the corner, alone, eating his meal with a grim determination and ignoring the well-meaning attempts at conversation. One Tuesday, the director of the center, a woman with an unflappably cheerful voice that grated on Samuel's nerves, made an announcement. The county health department was holding a health fair at their facility the following week, including a clinic to administer a new, highly recommended vaccination. A murmur went through the room. Some expressed relief, others apprehension. Samuel just snorted, loud enough for those at nearby tables to hear. "More poison," he muttered to himself, "as if we don't have enough problems." He had a deep-seated distrust of modern medicine, believing in toughing it out and letting nature take its course. He saw the push for new vaccinations as a business profiting from the fears of old age. Later that week, a woman approached his table. Her name was Grace. She was a volunteer, a widow like him, but she carried herself with a light that Samuel found both irritating and intriguing. "Samuel," she began, her voice soft, "I heard you had some concerns about the vaccination clinic." He stiffened. "I don't have concerns," he said gruffly. "I have an opinion. It's unnecessary." Grace didn't argue. "I understand why you might feel that way," she said. "But I was thinking about Margaret, the lady who used to sit by the window. She came down with a terrible pneumonia last winter. It hit her so hard, she never really recovered. She's in assisted living now. The doctor said this new vaccination could have prevented it." Samuel scowled. "People get sick. It's part of life. We don't need to be pumped full of chemicals for every little thing." Grace's smile didn't falter. "I don't see it as being pumped with chemicals," she said gently. "I see it as protecting our community, protecting each other." She gestured to the room full of seniors. "We're all a bit fragile in here, Samuel. My health depends on your health, and your health depends on mine. It's what Jesus taught, isn't it? To love our neighbors as ourselves. Sometimes that love is a kind word, and sometimes," she paused, her eyes meeting his, "it's as simple as getting a shot to keep the whole room a little bit safer." This is a fascinating and powerful argument from Grace. She's reframing a health decision as a spiritual and communal one. Do you agree with her? Is protecting the community's health a part of what it means to love thy neighbor? Let's discuss this below. Samuel was taken aback. He had expected a lecture on science, not a sermonette from a volunteer. "Leave Jesus out of it," he grumbled, turning to leave. "It's my body, my choice." As he walked away, he could feel her eyes on him, not with judgment, but with a kind of patient sadness. Her words followed him home. Community, protecting each other. The ideas were foreign to him. His community had been Eleanor. His world had been her. Since she was gone, he had walled himself off, convinced that independence meant isolation. That evening, sitting in his silent apartment, the silence felt different. It felt heavier. He looked at the empty chair across from his, Eleanor's chair, and a wave of loneliness so intense washed over him that it almost buckled his knees. He had been proud of his solitude, but for the first time, he wondered if his solitude was not a fortress, but a prison. Grace's words about Jesus echoed in his mind. He and Eleanor had been regular churchgoers. They had read the Bible together. But since her death, God felt like another friend who had moved away. What did loving your neighbor have to do with a vaccination? The idea seemed absurd, and yet it stuck with him. He thought about Margaret, a woman he had barely noticed, now confined to an assisted living facility. He thought about the other faces at the senior center, each with their own story, their own set of health concerns. Was his stubborn refusal, his common sense, a form of selfishness? The question was deeply unsettling. He pushed it away, annoyed at Grace for planting it in his mind. He was fine. He was healthy as a horse. He didn't need a shot. He went to bed that night, resolute in his decision. But as he lay in the dark, the faces from the senior center floated in his mind's eye. He saw Margaret by the window. He saw the frail man who always sat by the door. And he saw Grace, with her kind, persistent eyes. He was annoyed, deeply and thoroughly annoyed, because he knew that this was no longer a simple decision about his health. It had become a question about the kind of man he was, and the kind of man he wanted to be in the final, quiet years of his life. And for the first time, in a very long time, he wasn't entirely sure of the answer. The following day, Samuel walked into the senior center with a renewed sense of defiance. He was determined to ignore Grace, to show her that her little sermon had no effect on him. He got his lunch, found his corner table, and buried his head in a newspaper, creating a flimsy wall of paper between himself and the rest of the room. But Grace was not so easily deterred. He saw her out of the corner of his eye, moving with a quiet purpose, before she appeared at his table, holding a small cup of tea. "I thought you might like this, Samuel," she said, placing it down. "It's chamomile, good for settling the nerves." He grunted without looking up. "My nerves are fine." "Are they?" she asked softly. "You seem to carry a heavy burden, my friend." Samuel finally lowered his newspaper, his eyes flashing with irritation. "And what would you know about my burdens?" Grace pulled up a chair and sat down, an act so bold it momentarily stunned Samuel into silence. "I know a little," she said, her voice devoid of pity. "I know what it's like to lose the love of your life." Grace's shift in strategy here is so wise. Instead of arguing about facts, she tries to connect on a human level. Have you ever found that the best way to reach a stubborn loved one is to talk about something they love, rather than the problem at hand? Share your experience. Someone told me your wife, Eleanor, was the one who planted those beautiful rose bushes by the main entrance years ago. Is that true? The question was a complete surprise. It wasn't about his health, the vaccination, or his grumpy demeanor. It was about Eleanor. He hadn't spoken her name to a stranger in years. A wall inside him began to crumble. "She did," he found himself saying, his voice softer than he intended. "She said the entrance needed more color. She had a gift for making things beautiful." As he spoke, a memory surfaced, clear and bright. He told Grace about the day they planted those bushes, how Eleanor had directed him like a general, her hands covered in dirt, her face beaming with a joy so pure it had made his heart ache. He talked about how she would tend to them every week, and how, even now, seeing them bloom was a painful reminder of everything he had lost. He spoke for 10 minutes, the words spilling out of him, a torrent of memory and grief held back for too long. Grace didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her eyes full of a deep, compassionate understanding. When he finally fell silent, his throat tight with emotion, she didn't offer platitudes. She simply said, "She sounds like a wonderful woman. Her love is still growing out there for everyone to see. That's a beautiful legacy." Then she shared a piece of herself. "My husband, Frank, he was a woodworker," she began. "After he passed, I couldn't stand to look at the beautiful furniture he had made for our home. Each piece felt like an accusation, a reminder of his absence. I was angry, Samuel, so angry at God for taking him. I felt like my life story, our love story, had been torn in half." Samuel looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a volunteer, but as a peer, a fellow member of the tribe of the heartbroken. "So what changed?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you think is more helpful when you're grieving? Advice from others, or just hearing that someone else has felt the same way you do? Tell us your thoughts in the comments." "A friend from my church kept visiting," Grace explained. "She never pushed me. She just sat with me in my anger. One day she read me a passage from the Bible, from the book of John. It was when Jesus wept after his friend Lazarus died. Even though Jesus knew he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead, he still wept. He shared in the grief of his friends." She looked at Samuel, her eyes shining. "It was a revelation to me. My faith wasn't asking me to ignore my pain or my anger. God wasn't distant from my suffering. Jesus himself understood it. My friend told me, 'Grace, you can't honor Frank's life by ending your own.' So I started volunteering here, serving these people, listening to their stories. It's my way of honoring Frank's kind and generous spirit. It's how I keep our love story going." The conversation left Samuel feeling raw and exposed, but also, for the first time, a little less alone. He saw that Grace's faith wasn't a set of pious platitudes. It was a rugged, tested thing that had been forged in the same fire of grief that had consumed him. Her idea of community, of serving others as an expression of faith, no longer seemed so absurd. It was her answer to the same crushing loneliness he felt every single day. That night, the silence in his apartment felt different again. It was still lonely, but it was also contemplative. He thought about his own love story with Eleanor. Had he honored her memory by shutting himself away from the world? Eleanor, who loved people, who brought color and life wherever she went? Would she be proud of the bitter, isolated man he had become? He walked over to the bookshelf and pulled down the heavy family Bible. He didn't open it. He just held it, feeling its weight in his hands. He thought about Grace's words, about loving thy neighbor. He thought about the people at the senior center, each with their own unseen burdens, their own lost love stories. The week of the health fair arrived. Samuel walked into the senior center with a knot in his stomach. The main hall had been transformed. Nurses in scrubs sat at tables, and a long line of seniors was already forming for the vaccination clinic. He saw a mixture of fear and resolve on their faces. They were there for their health, yes, but he now saw something more. They were there for each other. His gaze found Grace. She was standing by an elderly woman in a wheelchair, holding her hand, speaking to her in a low, soothing voice. The woman was clearly frightened, and Grace was her rock, her calm presence a shield against the woman's fear. In that moment, Samuel saw the face of faith in action. It wasn't loud or preachy. It was quiet, humble, and compassionate service. It was love, pure and simple. Samuel stood by the doorway, his internal battle raging. Every cynical instinct told him to turn around, to go home to the safety of his solitude, his familiar fortress of defiance. It was the easy path, the one he had walked every day for 3 years. But Grace's words, her story, and the image of her holding that woman's hand pulled him in another direction. It was a path that required humility, a path that meant admitting he might be wrong, a path that led not away from people, but towards them. He watched the line move slowly forward, his heart pounding in his chest. This was more than a decision about a vaccination. It was a decision about how he would live the final chapter of his own life. Would it be a story of bitter isolation, or could it, just possibly, be a new kind of love? Story. He took a breath, a shallow, uncertain thing, and then another, deeper this time. It felt like an eternity, standing there in the doorway, between the man he had been and the man he could possibly become. This is a huge moment for Samuel. It's a step that requires so much humility. What do you think is the hardest part about admitting you might have been wrong, especially after being stubborn for a long time? Then, with a resolve that came from a place he didn't know he still possessed, he took a single step forward, and then another, walking away from his corner table and toward the end of the vaccination line. He didn't look at Grace. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, feeling a strange mixture of embarrassment and liberation. He was an old, stubborn man, and this was his surrender. The line moved slowly, a quiet procession of frail bodies and resilient spirits. When it was his turn, the nurse was kind and efficient. He barely felt the prick of the needle. The vaccination itself was anticlimactic, a small clinical event. But for Samuel, it felt momentous. It was an act of communion, a silent promise to the people in that room. It was him, in his own small way, taking care of his neighbor. After the mandatory 15-minute wait, he was free to go. The old Samuel would have bolted for the door, back to the safety of his apartment. But as he stood up, he saw Grace sitting at a table with the woman from the wheelchair, whose name he now learned was Esther. They were drinking tea, and Grace was listening intently to Esther's story. Samuel hesitated for only a moment before walking over to their table. "Is everything all right, Esther?" he asked, his own voice sounding foreign to him. Both women looked up, surprised. Esther, a woman with kind, watery eyes, gave him a small, grateful smile. "Oh, yes. Thank you for asking. My arm is a little sore, but Grace was just telling me it's perfectly normal." Grace's eyes met Samuel's, and in them, there was no "I told you so," no look of victory. There was only a quiet, profound welcome. "Would you like to join us, Samuel?" she asked. And for the first time in 3 years, he did. He sat down, not as a cynical observer, but as a participant. He listened as Esther talked about her grandchildren. He heard Grace share a funny story from her week, and when they asked him a question, he answered, sharing a small piece of his day. It was awkward and unfamiliar, but it wasn't gray. There were flickers of color in their conversation, in their shared laughter. That day was the turning point. Samuel didn't transform into a social butterfly overnight. He was still a man of few words, with a gruff exterior that he had worn for too long to simply discard. But the fortress around his heart had been breached. He started sitting with Grace and Esther every day, at the senior center. Soon, their table for 3 became a table for 4, then 5. He found himself in the middle of a community he had so long despised. He learned the names and stories behind the faces he had ignored for years. He discovered that nearly everyone in that room was nursing a private grief, a quiet heartache, a story of a love lost. They were all in their own way, just trying to navigate the final chapters of their own love stories. His faith, which had felt like a distant, cold star, began to draw nearer, to offer warmth. He started reading his wife's Bible in the evenings, not as a chore, but as a conversation. He found that the teachings of Jesus were not abstract principles. They were practical instructions on how to live. Bear one another's burdens. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Mourn with those who mourn. These weren't just nice words. They were a roadmap out of the prison of self-pity he had built for himself. Samuel finds his new purpose not in grand gestures, but in small, daily acts of kindness. What small act of service, either given or received, has made a big impact on your life? He found a new purpose, not in grand gestures, but in small acts of service. He started arriving at the senior center early to help set up the coffee station. He used his strong, clear voice to read the daily news headlines aloud for those whose eyesight was failing. He, the man who had cherished his isolation, became a quiet pillar of the community. His relationship with Grace deepened into a beautiful platonic friendship, a bond built on shared loss and a rediscovered faith in God. They would often walk by the rose bushes Eleanor had planted. "She would have liked you, Grace," Samuel said one day, the admission costing his pride a great deal. Grace simply smiled. "I think I would have liked her too." Life was not suddenly easy. His grief for Eleanor was still a part of him, a quiet ache that would likely never fully disappear. But it was no longer the defining feature of his existence. He had learned that it was possible to carry sorrow in one hand and joy in the other. He had learned that the best way to honor the love you've lost is by sharing the love you still have to give. Samuel's world went from gray to colorful again through connection. Who is the Grace in your life? Someone who showed you kindness when you needed it most? Give them a shout out in the comments. His world, once gray and silent, was now filled with the color of friendship, the sound of laughter, and the quiet, steady warmth of a faith put into action. The story of Samuel teaches us that it is never too late to change the narrative of our lives. It shows that even after the most profound loss, a new purpose can be found, not in closing ourselves off from the world, but in opening our hearts to them. Community around us. It is a powerful reminder that our health is more than just a personal responsibility. It is an act of love for our neighbors, and it reveals that a faith in God that seems lost can be rediscovered, not always in grand revelations, but in the simple, humble act of caring for another human being. If this story of second chances touched your spirit, please help our community grow by leaving a like and subscribing to Stories Beyond 50. Your support helps these messages find their way to those who need them most. And now, as we always do, we turn the story over to you. This is your space to share your wisdom. How have you found purpose after a great loss? Has being part of a community, whether at a senior center, a church, or among friends, helped you heal? We believe your stories are the lifeblood of this channel, and we invite you to share your experience in the comments below. If you're not ready to write your story, but you believe in the power of community to heal a lonely heart, just write the single word community in the comments. Let us create a wave of connection right here, right now. We read and value every single word you share with us. Thank you for your courage and your heart. God bless you, and we will see you in the next story.